Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome wherever you are in any part of the world. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us today. We are thrilled to have Mike Trainor joining us as our guest speaker for our next Practices Live. Mike is quite an impressive individual, and all I'm going to say about him is that well, he spent 7 years in the Pacific Department of the Asian Development Bank, and he was recently, right, Mike, transferred as energy specialist to the Central and West Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank. And we have some questions for him, as Rebecca very well explained. Just want to clarify, though, that Mike's comments and views are his own in this case, and they're not going to necessarily be the views of the bank itself, just before we get started. And I just want to go ahead for the sake of time. First of all, to thank you, Mike, very much for being here with us. As you know, we are being joined by participants who are in different countries for this webinar. They're in different areas of the world. And I'd love to hear from you, if you could just give us a sense, of what the pandemic is doing, how it is impacting the Pacific, in your opinion. What is going on in the Pacific during this pandemic?
Thank you, Araceli. Thank you and greetings to everyone who's joined us from all parts of the world, wherever you are. I hope you're well. And to those who are directly affected by the COVID crisis, health-wise, yourselves or your loved ones, you're certainly in our thoughts, and we hope the best for your recovery from the crisis, both in all terms, in health-wise as well as getting through this very hard time in terms of economics and running your businesses if you're in the utility business. Thank you once again for the opportunity to address this audience. It's a privilege, and I appreciate it very much. The context in the Pacific, where I've spent the past 7 years working at ADB, I transferred to my new department literally 10 days before we were all sent home to work from home. And so I've had one foot in each department since that, gradually transitioning or completing my transition to the Central and West Asia Department, but most of my experience with the Asian Development Bank has been in the Pacific, and so that's where most of our discussion will certainly, of course, focus. The context, I'm sure, is not unique to the Pacific, but this crisis is having an impact on utilities' ability to operate, primarily through a drastic and very quick drop in revenues associated with decrease in demand. In the Pacific, there are some other features in the economy that I think make it particularly vulnerable to a crisis like this one. A lot of the countries in the Pacific are dependent on tourism, some more than others, but it's a factor in virtually every country in the Pacific where the Asian Development Bank is active. And of course, those revenues have dried up. And with that, hotel demand, the hospitality industry's consumption of electric power is dropped rapidly. And so utilities revenues are falling. Same in certain commercial sectors where there's been a drop in demand in industry with the inability for industry to send their wares abroad. Those sorts of disruptions also cause a decrease in demand. So revenues are suffering. And finally, in the Pacific, a lot of households' expenditures are covered by remittances. And I'm hypothesizing here. I don't have any empirical or even anecdotal evidence to offer to substantiate this, but I suspect very strongly that remittances have dried up in a lot of countries. And so households' ability to pay for their own consumption is also strained now, more than ever. It's already been a strain in a lot of cases. There is a potential upside here, of course, with the global crisis. Utilities fuel costs will be going down, so that helps. But fixed costs remain, and the lights still need to be kept on, and these costs need to be covered, and utilities revenues are of course in jeopardy. So this is something we need to look at, and I think that's one of the dimensions of the problem that we want to discuss today. So
yeah,
that's the context.
Thank you. Yeah, it's affecting everybody, but definitely, yeah, it's all, well, it's quite deep. So many, as you have very well mentioned already, many utilities around the world are being financially affected. They're struggling financially with the pandemic. What are any practical solutions that you are suggesting to utilities for the time being?
Yeah, we've just as I was getting ready to leave for my new department, we were working with some utilities in anticipation of the strain to come. A lot of them had already, long before we were all sent home to go to work from home 2 months ago, a lot of countries in the Pacific had already limited or even banned travel from outside. So the impact was already on the horizon for the reasons we just discussed. So in terms of practical options that any utility should be looking at, and then this is certainly not an exhaustive list. I'm sure many utilities can offer some pretty innovative measures as examples of what they're doing. But I think some of the things that we've been recommending is, first of all, the obvious, to identify what your priority functions are, what you need to do, what you need to continue to fund to keep the lights on. And then maybe put some optional expenditures on the back burner. This is a way of saving costs. Essentially, you need to save costs, tighten your belt when faced with a loss of revenue, as most utilities are. And I think there's the old adage of take care of the pennies and the pounds will take care of themselves. There are a lot of small things that utilities have to carry as costs. Things like use of company vehicles for trips that may not be necessary. This is obviously the immediate savings there would come in fuel use. But for a lot of utilities, that goes. It's not very well controlled already as a practice. A lot of utilities have let it become sort of an unwritten practice that utility workers can use the utilities vehicles for personal use 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that comes at a cost. It's sort of a unrecorded benefit for utilities employees. I think it's something that utilities really need to be taking a look at. I'm speaking from experience in certain countries in the Pacific. I know this to be the case. So things like that. So all the small things add up, and at a time like this, I think they need to be critically examined. Other things that utilities can do to reduce costs are reduce payroll expenses. Everybody has to tighten their belts, and this may also impact employees. First of all, a lot of utilities make it a practice to allow employees to book overtime. And a lot of utilities, a lot of employees use that opportunity to book overtime with few questions asked about its necessity. That all adds up in terms of payroll. Households come to depend on overtime as a way of boosting the employees' take-home pay. But at a time like this, that's really hard to justify, and it's simply not affordable. Other things that can be done are voluntary furloughs. If people would like to go home and read, all the volumes of Dostoevsky they have on the shelves that they've been dying to read for years and years, now's a good time to do that if they can afford to on a voluntary basis. That's where I would start in terms of furloughs. Or even a reduction in number of work hours worked each week by those employees that may have a little bit of time on their hands while they're actually on the clock, not being very productive. Maybe there's a place to cut to reduce payroll costs. And finally, I think from an operational perspective, and I'm sure all the power plant operators are already looking at this, but I think it needs to be mentioned. You've got a change in your demand pattern right now, where you've got substantially decreased load. Your load profile might be completely different from what you're used to. And certainly your loads are going to be lower. Look at how you're operating your power plants. Have you optimized dispatch? Or are you running all your gensets as you had before, but at a lower capacity factor, thereby reducing fuel efficiency? So look at how you're operating your power plant and see if you can come up with a different dispatch arrangement so that you are not holding too much spinning reserve available at a cost that you can avoid. So those are some ideas. I'm sure there are a lot of other creative ways to reduce costs at this time, but reducing costs is extremely important for as a response to declining revenues.
Definitely plenty of ideas. Thank you for sharing all those. Oftentimes what happens in times of crisis and other stressors is that weaknesses in how utilities provide services are revealed. So thinking about that, what weaknesses do you see surfacing in aspects of government, of management and regulation?
Well, I think this crisis is going to really drive a message home. And that is that utilities, by and large, across the region in the Pacific, and I'm sure again in lots of other places in the world with developing economies, they're operating on a shoestring budget, cash in, cash out type basis, and tariffs are generally inefficient, both in design and certainly seldom fully sufficient to cover utilities' long-run marginal costs. And so what we see is a periodic recapitalization of utilities and treating that capital stock as a source of subsidy. And an eventual decapitalization of your utility leads you to the point where your utility is no longer able to operate. Things start to fail and you need to be replaced. The utility doesn't have any liquidity, any cash reserves available for reinvestment because they haven't been collecting on the depreciation charge. So that needs to be looked at, and that's obviously not a sustainable regime. It's only sustainable when you have a source of recapitalization, such as a development partner, like multilateral development banks like ADB or others, or the government can periodically come back and re-inject capital in its state-owned enterprise. And for the most part, utilities in the Pacific are state-owned enterprises.
Okay.
So I mentioned tariff regimes. I think very few utilities have any liquidity reserves at all, but where they do, it's very tempting to allow that, even if they're intended for a specific purpose, like reinvestment in plant that needs to be replaced at the end of its life. It's very tempting at times like this to tap into that liquidity reserve to meet daily operating costs, to cover current costs. And that's all well and good, it's justifiable. However, as a short-term measure, it's justifiable. But very few regulatory regimes, to the extent they exist as such at all, in the common understanding of regulatory regime, very few of them are elaborate enough to provide for a mechanism for that liquidity reserve to be recovered after the crisis has passed through a tariff adjustment. It's just not practice. It really doesn't. That I guess underscores the importance of really focusing on the regulatory and policy regime in countries where, as I said, most utilities are driven to operate on a cash-in, cash-out basis, meet current costs, not look at the big picture, long-term capital costs and long-term financial viability of the utility. And a crisis like this only brings that message home, as did the crisis in mid-2008 when oil went through the roof and was well over $100 a barrel. Mm-hmm. It was a shock, and this is another shock where not costs aren't necessarily going down, but revenues are decreasing. So it's sort of the other side of the equation, but it's a financial shock regardless for the utilities. So there's a need to have a regulatory regime in place that both anticipates shocks like this and makes some sort of provision for how to respond. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, once the shock passes, utilities and their regulators or proxies for regulators, as the case may be in most countries, that is the case. There is no regulator per se. They need to be able to actually apply what they put on paper in advance of the shock and put it into practice.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah. So on a different topic here, but all related, of course, politicians are right now under enormous pressure to protect citizens and to ease their burdens. This type of pressure is what makes it really hard for them to confront the financial realities of the utilities at the moment. Do you have any thoughts on how to hold difficult conversations with politicians about utility financial needs?
Well, it's hard. It's hard, but as there's a cliche that I'm sure everybody has already heard, that crisis equals opportunity, and there's a Chinese character that means both things at the same time. I guess in the Chinese language, that's the case. Crisis is opportunity, and it is. This crisis, as I said, is going to drive home the message that these utilities that were already strained financially can survive and continue to keep the lights on at an acceptable level of quality and reliability as long as everything's going okay. But financially strong utility would be able to maintain service much more comfortably during an extended period of crisis like COVID is most likely going to be. So the strain on these utilities represents an opportunity to re-engage with governments and policymakers and stakeholders across the board on the need to focus on meaningful and comprehensive reform of the utility sector. Mm-hmm. And so we need, like I said, I think there needs to be a better understanding of what the big picture is. The paradigm that most utilities in the region have come to operate in of invest, operate, allowed to defer maintenance because that keeps current costs down if you don't, and eventually see utility service come to a halt when assets are no longer operable and there's no capital replacement plan in place. Things go south, and that paradigm and that mindset needs to disappear, needs to be changed. And utilities are a long-term business. Politics is generally focused on much more short-term goals. And so this is where I guess we have a disconnect. So we need to focus on a way to bridge that sort of divide, the temporal divide between short-term imperatives that politicians are usually focused on with the long-term needs of public utilities. There are ways to get around that. One of which is having a professional cadre staffing a quasi-independent regulatory body that can, to the extent humanly possible, disengage themselves from day-to-day politics or even year-to-year politics and look at the long-term health of the sector for the benefit of enterprises, the state-owned enterprises, the companies, and also customers that they serve ultimately. but the message is utilities need to be paid. Utility service needs to be paid for, and we want to pay as little as possible, but we want to pay enough to keep the service running. And the way you do that is really to focus on efficiency of your utility, both in terms of investment decisions, but also in terms of operations, financial management, planning. All of these things, need to be invested in for the utilities, and that includes development of skills and expertise within utilities employees. So that they're able to, whether they be in the financial management, in the sort of the back office business side of operations, or of course the vocational skills, power plant operators and mechanics and linemen, they all need to be well trained. So investment in people is, I guess, what it boils down to. Is incredibly important for utilities to be able to operate more efficiently, reliably, and to ultimately keep costs down while providing service at acceptable levels.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. I do have some other questions for you, but I'd love to hear and check on our chat if there are any questions there, or Rebecca, if maybe somebody would like to ask any questions using the microphone and or video features directly. So I'll be digging into the chat, but also if you could ask everybody, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I don't believe we have any questions quite yet in the chat. For those of you that are interested and we can share your audio, what we'd ask for you to do is at the bottom of your screen, if you're working from a laptop or a desktop, in the toolbar, there's a participants button. You would select participants, and then a box will pop up in the right, and that's where you'll find the raise your hand feature. So if you'd like to ask your question directly to Mike, or also share a bit of your own experience, we'd ask for you to go ahead and raise your hand to be in the queue, and we will prompt you. And then also you can direct questions to everyone in the chat.
So we'll give that a couple of seconds and see if anybody would like to ask any questions. Otherwise, I do have some more questions that I'd love to hear Mike's opinion on. In fact, I think we'll go ahead. Do we have any hands raised, Rebecca, that you can see?
Not quite yet.
Not quite yet. Okay. So, Mike, I do have another question for you, and this is kind of sensitive, but what are some mistakes that you see utilities and or government making as they try to deal with the financial impacts?
Well,
what are those mistakes?
Immediate options are few. I don't think anyone, whether it be a household or a public utility, is going to escape this crisis without feeling some kind of pain, and let alone people who are directly affected health-wise from the virus.
Yeah.
That said, I think, as I've said already, we need to refocus policymakers, discussion with policymakers on the long-term viability of the utilities. Much of this comes back to tariff policy, and tariffs in most countries in the Pacific that I've worked in, which is most of ADB's member countries, numbering 14 countries in the Pacific, to varying degrees. I've worked in and with people in those countries, and so know the situation. And most of them, from the perspective of tariff policy and tariff structures, most of them are skewed, and very few of them are sufficient to cover long-run marginal cost of the business. But they're skewed in a way. Also, they're treated as a mechanism and also a source of funding for low-income subsidy. But it's not really efficient. It's basically, we're talking about cross-subsidization by large consumers, your businesses, your hotel industry, or what have you, commercial customers and industrial customers pay far above the actual cost of providing service to those customer classes as a way of cross-subsidizing residential customer consumption. And this exists in most places. Some places it's quite stark, in other places it's more subtle, but it's prevalent, if not ubiquitous. And that's inefficient in and of itself. I mean, all residential customers end up benefiting from a skewed cross-subsidizing tariff structure like that, even when they don't need it. There are a lot of people who don't actually need subsidized power consumption because they're wealthy enough as it is. But worse than that, the problems with that become immediately evident at times like this, when you have all your revenues from the commercial sector, hotel industry, or even industry. When they dry up, where's your source of cross-subsidization at that point? It's no longer there at all. So there needs to be a focus on a more rationalized program and mechanism for delivery of subsidy of low-cost households, low-income households consumption that's directed and targeted at households that actually need to be provided some sort of subsidy, and not at the expense of the utility. It needs to be something that's funded directly from the state budget, rather than somehow magically being drawn from utilities' already strained revenues.
Let me ask you.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, no. There's just another question linked to that. And do you see any utilities that could possibly, go bankrupt? And what might be the fallout if that happens in your close area?
It would not surprise me, and I won't name names. Some of them may be on the call, I'm not sure, but a lot of them are already vulnerable. As I said, we're operating on a cash-in, cash-out basis. That cash-out part is really hard to control. You still need to buy fuel, even though fuel is going to be less costly. You still need to pay payroll. I mean, bankrupt, I suppose, has different meanings, but yeah, I think
right.
Yeah, defaulting on current obligations quite likely will be something we see in the near future in a lot of places where the utilities' revenues were already strained, and they were already having to pick and choose what current obligations they meet and what they would defer, and that's only going to get worse with declining revenues.
Yeah. We do have a couple of questions here in the chat that I'd like to ask you, Mike. So Ian Peter is asking, do you see utilities giving in to government pressure to reduce rates during this period?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know of a number of instances where utilities have already either voluntarily in anticipation that they would be asked to do so, or because they've already been explicitly asked to do so by their governments, which are the owners of the utilities ultimately, to not enforce disconnection for non-payment. That means that's another loss of revenue for the utility that's sanctioned. And as far as rate reductions, I'd like to point to an example of a different way for a government to respond to the pain that households are enduring right now, and the strain on them that having to pay for power service is actually putting on them. There's a country in my new department, in fact, that I just recently learned the government has announced a plan to actually pay the utility bills over the next 3 months on behalf of the households for up to a certain consumption level. So households consuming up to 200 kilowatt hours per month will have their bills paid for by the government to the utility on the household's behalf, directly to the utility. That's clearly going to be both popular with those households that benefit from that. Surely a reduction in rates would be popular as well, but at least this way you are doing two things. You're putting cash into the economy by allowing households to, money's fungible, so households, if they don't have to pay their utility bill, they can actually use that money for some other critical need. But you're also keeping your utility, closer to being able to remain afloat. So that would be, I think, a better policy response from the government rather than directing utilities to reduce rates, which they can't even afford to do. They're not even, for the most part, collecting sufficient, again, as I said, for long-term financial sustainability. And there are ways that MDBs can help with that. ADB and other multilateral development banks are already extending what we call policy-based loans or policy-based grants, as the case may be. In a lot of the Pacific countries, they come in the form of grants that are direct injections of funds into the state budget to allow the state to use that money for whatever social need is necessary. And one of the options for use of such a lending facility or a grant-making facility would be to use some of that money to fund the type of stream that I just referred to in Georgia, where the government is picking up utility bills on customers' behalf, and at the same time providing assistance to utilities that are under a lot of financial strain. So that's something that that's a way that the multilateral development banks can help directly and indirectly utilities and governments in this time of crisis. And that's already being done in a lot of places.
Okay. Well, I have another question for you. Don't you think that private corporation or private operating utilities should absorb the loss since it's part of their business risk? This is the reason why why government is not the one operating and opened it to private companies to pass the risk. So do you have anything that you'd like to contribute or comment on in what I just said, possibly?
Well, I'm a proponent of private sector operations of the utility business. I think I think it's well understood, and I guess it's a question of your political philosophy, but I think it's generally accepted that the private sector is more efficient than the public sector in most areas of business. You look at the British car industry. They made horrible cars when they were all state-owned. They make somewhat better cars now after the British auto industry was privatized. You look at but I mean, I'm kind of being glib. Yes, I think the private sector is a privatization of utilities is preferable as a long-term goal to perpetual state-owned utilities operations. In my view, I think you get a lot more efficiencies. You have better incentive mechanisms because of shareholder pressure to increase value and profitability. But you have to be careful when you do that to guard against the propensity of private monopolies from abusing their monopoly power. So you need a strong regulatory regime in place with competent regulators to guard against that and to allow utilities to make a normal profit while at the same time shielding their captive customers from the abuses of a monopoly industry. Now, I guess the question that you asked was whether in places where the private sector is operating the utility business, they should be bearing all of the pain associated with this crisis. I think they should bear a larger portion of it. I think in this sense, there would be very little that differentiates shareholders of those companies from shareholders of, say, the airline industry. And we know that the airline industry is, at least in the United States, receiving a lot of support from the government. And other industries are receiving a lot of support from the state to help them get past the crisis, the economic crisis that the COVID pandemic is causing. Private utilities should benefit no less, no more, I think, than other industries in terms of state support in this troubling time. But I would in more developed economies, I would say privately owned and privately operated utilities have done a much better job in provisioning for crises like this. I mean, again, a crisis in the Persian Gulf could cause energy prices to skyrocket. I'm sure utilities that are reliant on fossil fuel generation would have already made some contingency plans to respond to that type of crisis. This one's probably, it's different in its nature, but I think private utilities are probably better prepared than state-owned utilities to respond to a crisis like this.
Thank you, Mike. I do have a couple more questions actually, yes, in the chat, and one is from Jack Chungum, and he says, how do you plan for financial capacity within disaster reduction framework and management? How do you plan for financial capacity within disaster reduction framework and management?
I think I know what Jack is referring to. Financial management of utilities in our region is already rudimentary and weak, and very few firms have, as I said, any liquidity reserves to, no rainy day fund exists, or nothing that can be tapped into to serve the purpose of a rainy day fund exists, because they're not accumulating liquidity. And I guess there is a good linkage here between, focus on financial management practices as a way to bolster utilities' ability to respond to crisis. A stronger financially performing utility would be in much better position to weather this crisis than ones that are already financially strained. So I think there's a in terms of disaster risk reduction funding that MDBs may have available to support utilities, I think a good argument can be made that focus on financial health of utilities is a legitimate use of disaster risk reduction funding, because this type of disaster, it's not a natural disaster, it's not a typhoon or a tsunami. It hasn't wiped your assets into the ocean, which is good, but it's having other very severe impacts on utilities' ability to operate. So I think I think you raise a good point, Jack, and I think it's worth exploring further with your colleagues with respect to DRR funding, disaster risk reduction funding.
Excellent, thank you. I have another question from Jack as well, and he'd like to, he's sending it to the chat. What sorts of role should government utility board members address or can address or help mitigate to help mitigate the current pandemic we're in? So what sorts of role should government utility board members address to help mitigate the current pandemic? Not an easy question, huh?
You stumped me. I'm trying to dissect that question.
Sorry, if maybe you can see the chat, I'm not sure, but if you can.
No, I think I heard you very clearly, but let me move my cursor over to the chat box here and open this up.
Yeah, it's towards the last.
Yeah, I'm down at the bottom there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's the expectation of utility board members, boards of directors, is really no different now from what it would be in normal times. Board members, I know the case of Jack's utility, they come from various walks of life. Few of them have, if any, direct experience in operating utility. They need to recognize that, and I think they do. But what's expected of them is to understand the utility's business needs. You know, their sole responsibility should be to you know, serve shareholder interest, create shareholder value in the company, whether it be state-owned or private. That's the role of a board member. It wants to keep the enterprise healthy and strong. So I think the board members should really listen to the challenges that its management are facing, and management has a responsibility to you know, deliver the unvarnished truth to board members to help them come to that understanding. But board members do need to see their role as trying to direct management to make decisions that are tenable and sustainable and that benefit the company. Because ultimately the company's purpose for existence is to provide utility service. And if the company is unable to do that because of inefficient decisions at the board or management level, somebody's not doing the job. And I think board members need to be supportive of management, but also need to provide direction to management based on advice that management is able to give them. So you've got your job too, as a CEO of a utility, in communicating what your current challenges are and what you think are appropriate responses. You seek their endorsement if they don't have.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, actually, Rebecca's letting me know that Jack is going to share some more. How is that going to happen, Rebecca? Is he going to use the microphone feature maybe, or?
Sure. Jack, I just unmuted you, and just to give a little context, Jack, and he can expand on this, is in the Marshall Islands, I believe. And so we've had a number of participants who are, or a couple that are logged in now, and I know others that are registered from island countries in the Caribbean. And so we thought we might benefit to hear from another island area. So Jack, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Jack.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Likewise.
Yeah, I'm going to clarify my question. So, you know, like for Marshall's Energy Company, we have a tariff schedule that's based on, it was established back in 2014. And it's based on the global price of, you know, diesel fuel.
Yep.
We've never, since 2014, we've never really followed that schedule. We've been like using or charging the same tariff since 2014. And you know that since then, you know, the price has dropped, but in recent months, it has drastically dropped because of the this crisis or pandemic. And then, of course, it's got the attention of the government, and you know, they're looking at what other countries are doing to try and help, you know, the community, the public, and it's now, I guess, sort of like MEC, Marshall's Energy Company, is sort of being pressured at the moment because, you know, everybody's aware that fuel prices have really come down. Of course, our electricity tariff has remained the same. So we're getting a lot of pressure from government, which goes to the board and of course to management, saying that, you know, we should be reducing our electricity rate. And what we're, I guess, trying to explain to our board, and it's part of the question, the purpose of my question was, do we listen into these pressures, or do we just continue with the, you know, business as usual? Because, as you know, like a company, utility company like MEC, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And whatever savings that we can get, like from, you know, the current situation, you know, with the fuel price, you know, we want to use that, of course, savings and invest it on you know, like improving deteriorating assets, deteriorating network distribution systems, So I think as far as like, for government, and this is what we're trying to educate or convey to our board, is that, yeah, it's good that fuel prices come down a lot, but we need to plan for the future. Let's think, seize the opportunity, use the savings and put them into the infrastructure or the asset that needs to be improved. So that was really, the sort of like the basis of the question that I raised earlier. Thank you.
I see. Yeah, I'm, as you know, I'm familiar with the tariff plan that you have, and it sounds something like a fuel pass-through mechanism, but in fact, it's not. The retail tariff in the Marshall Islands is basically indexed to world oil prices, and that's it. It's not based on any comprehensive assessment of actual costs. Costs aren't broken down, and then the tariff isn't built up based on justifiable costs for things that are prudently invested in and used and useful to provide utility service, as the professional jargon goes. We've been talking with the Marshall Islands, Marshall's Energy Company, for quite some time about the need to revisit that tariff structure. And indeed, as 2014, we had quite high oil prices. We were, again, on the other side of $100 a barrel at a certain point around that time. And more recently, until the COVID crisis hit, we were in the $50 to $70 range for most of the past several years. Tariffs were still stuck at the old tariff band, with oil stuck between $90 and $100 or whatever band it was when it was adopted. It hasn't been adjusted down. So yeah, Marshall's Energy Company has been benefiting from somehow getting away with not reducing tariffs as their tariff methodology required them to do. The way it's, and it's been a windfall for MEC, which certainly they can use because they have a lot of reinvestment needs in network and plant, and this has been a boon for them to be able to fund some of that critical work. But it's opaque, and this is really not the way things are supposed to operate. This is sort of, it's reminiscent, or it's I guess one aspect of what I was describing earlier, which is utilities companies operating on a cash-in, cash-out basis, sort of an opportunistic basis, where current costs, or in the case of MEC that we just described, with a little bit of a windfall, some reinvestment priorities being funded finally, but this is not planning. Responding to opportunity is not a good surrogate for careful planning that's subjected to scrutiny by your board or by your regulator or whoever you have in place. That's the regime that we would like to see MEC and other utilities in the region sort of transition to. So in this instance, Jack, I don't know. I think the demand to reduce your tariffs in accordance with the current policy, flawed as that policy may be, in terms of the tariff structure, I don't think it's an unreasonable demand. I mean, it's consistent with policy. The policy was adopted. It has the force of law. I believe that's the case, and it should be implemented the way it is, until you replace it with a better thought out tariff regime. I sympathize with your position, but I think it would be a little bit disingenuous to say that I think the tariff regime that MEC has in place is appropriate. It's not. And for the most part, MEC is not well served by the way that the tariff is designed in the Marshall Islands.
So, Mike, I have one final question for you. I just like to throw this question out there and just simply ask, who is having a better experience or the better experience so far in your region, do you think? And what can others do to learn from it, possibly to imitate? And by experience that, just pick, I'm like, could be which one of the countries might be, doing maybe a little bit better, or which one of the utilities that you're aware of are doing maybe a little bit better, and what can everybody else learn from what they're doing, how they're doing, just so that, we make some progress in the right direction.
You've put me on the spot because...
Sorry. Yeah.
I think there are a number of examples of utilities whose management and stakeholders and governments and boards are really trying to do the right thing. And Jack's utility is one of them. I think they're engaged and they're very strongly committed to a reform program. Other utilities in the Pacific are engaging with ADB and other development partners on meaningful and comprehensive reform efforts. So I think the story is still to be written. So it's hard really to point to one example of a utility that's a shining example that others should emulate, because we haven't got there anywhere yet. Some are in much stronger position. The Fiji Electricity Authority, or Energy Fiji Limited, as it's now known, of course, is recognized as the strongest utility in the region, lowest tariffs in the region, and you can thank the fact that they have a lot of legacy hydropower for that. But they're strong. They're the biggest economy in the region, and so I guess you can point to them as an example of utility that's closer to a world-class utility, because they're big and they have, as I said, a lot of legacy hydro capacity that helps them keep tariffs down. Operating costs are quite low, and they're able to employ a lot of people and pay those people what they're worth. And that's another thing I think we need to focus on long term as we come out of this crisis and we look at strengthening utilities in the region. I mentioned investment in people earlier. No policymaker is going to deny the fact that utilities need to buy fuel and pay for it. You pay what the market tells the fuel is worth. So that's never controversial. That's the thing that gets paid first, otherwise the lights go off, period. Everyone recognizes that. I think there's less of a recognition of the value of people and expertise. And it's really difficult in small utilities, in small countries where there's a lot of immigration. A lot of people are able to leave as soon as they have marketable skills. They leave because their employment opportunities and remuneration just isn't there in their own countries. I think it needs to be recognized that utilities operations is a specialized business, and if you want to hire and retain talented people that possess the necessary expertise, you need to be prepared to pay for them as a resource, just as you pay for your fuel, because otherwise the lights go out without good people. So I wanted to get that in there as a message as well.
Thank you, Mike. I said this would be the last question. It sounds like we have one more request. Is that right, Rebecca?
I think that we do. We'll quickly, if they're interested, Tolagata is with the Electric Power Corporation and Samoa. Are you there?
Yes, Rebecca.
Hello.
I've just posted my question. My question is, how can the Asian Development Bank assist the utilities with their feed-in tariff, with IPPs, those IPPs with the projects funded by the Asian Development Bank. How can you assist with that?
Well, that's a good question. I have my own view on the advisability of a feed-in tariff. If you take the case of Germany, a feed-in tariff scheme was really, really successful in seeing rapid investment in the expansion of renewable generation. And if that's your measure of success, clearly a feed-in tariff regime, if that's your objective, a feed-in tariff regime can be a very useful policy tool. But what the feed-in tariff scheme in Germany also succeeded in doing was actually raising the cost of generation significantly for German consumers. And if that's something you want to avoid, you have to ask yourself whether a feed-in tariff regime is really appropriate. I'm skeptical, frankly, on the high prioritization that a lot of countries in the Pacific have put on expanding renewables beyond, a very low level of penetration, without considering what the consequences are on utilities costs. Those costs are often masked, as I said before, because renewables are capital intensive, and operating costs are quite low. And if utilities are only collecting revenues to cover current operating costs, and their tariffs only provide for that, and if the renewable plant has been funded by a grant rather than by utility raising capital somehow on a commercial basis or from its own depreciation reserve, if utilities often almost universally have been treating that granted asset with it's a zero book value basically for all intents and purposes. It's not actually recovering the cost of that asset in its tariffs because it's been put on its books from a capital grant. And so you ask what is going to happen at the end of the plant's useful life when it needs to be replaced. Where are you going to get the capital to replace it? You'll have to go back either to grant-making entities like ADB or World Bank or other IDBs or bilaterals, or you'll have to raise it if you're able through borrowing. And most utilities in the Pacific aren't able to borrow commercially, maybe through concessional loans from MDBs. But actually, the tide has been shifting in the direction towards more and more utilities being reliant solely on granted capital. But on feed-in tariffs, I don't think it's an appropriate policy tool for utilities in the Pacific. The only beneficiary is going to be the IPP, and not your consumers. It's only going to serve, in all likelihood, to increase the utilities cost. That's my view, and I mean the detail can be fleshed out in a discussion of any specific example. But that's all I'll say. And as Araceli mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, these are my views, not necessarily those of the Asian Development Bank.
Well, thank you so very much again, Mike. Thank you for obviously a great talk. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for your candor. Of course, thank you for your time. And hope to see you soon. Stay healthy. Yeah, I hope things are going to get better soon for everybody. That would be very much welcome. I appreciate your participation, and I thank everybody in the audience for being here.